Welcome to our Responsible Business Conversations, where we have leaders that think differently. This series is brought to you by Integrated Thinking Solutions. This is a space where we delve into environmental, social, and governance issues, as well as ESG issues, whereby business practices are putting our future at risk. This is a space for courageous leaders who step forward, who think differently, who think boldly in order to shape a responsible business of tomorrow. In today's session, we are going to be having a conversation about inclusive inclusion. Okay, inclusive inclusion is a tautology. Says more or less the same thing, but it beautifully emphasizes why we're having this conversation around inclusion. So the key question that we're asking to organizations that is out there is, when you think about inclusion in your own organization, what is the lived experience? What are the people feeling? Is it one, that everybody's invited, but we've got a dominant culture here that in order to be successful, you need to assimilate, you need to fit in, the dominant culture works for us, so we celebrate sameness, works for us? Or is it a culture, or is it an inclusion that says everybody's invited? We've got a dominant culture, but we know and we appreciate your difference, because your difference elevates us. It elevates our product, it elevates our organization, it elevates the ability of this organization to be sustainable into the future. So as an organization, which one is yours? I don't know. Rehema doesn't know. So, but it's for you to think about. I will not be unpacking this topic by myself. I will be unpacking this topic with the powerful and brilliant Rehema Isa. And she's going to be telling us a little bit about herself and the work that she does as this business strategist, and a whole lot of other elements that she does. Rehema, welcome, and thank you for your time.
Namta, thank you so much. It's such an honor, pleasure, privilege to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation. I was a bit daunted even with your intro, and I'm thinking, am I the right person?
Definitely the right person.
Am I the right person to be having this conversation? I don't know if I'm skilled, but maybe that's part of the exploration conversation. Who is skilled to have these, right?
Exactly. You are here because you're a bold leader, you're courageous, and you definitely think out of the box. So I definitely know that you are the right person for the job.
Thank
All
you.
right. So let us start off by unpacking this inclusive inclusion work with us. All right. So Rahima, just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, and then start going into your definition or your view of the importance of inclusive inclusion.
Yeah, I always struggle with what do I do, because sometimes I think of when I wake up, I think, what don't I do? And I think I've wrapped it up into I use my skills and talents to the best of my ability every day. So part of my world, I think I'll occupy multiple worlds in terms of the work that I do, with latitude to do so because of the choices I've made of how I exist and how I guess, transact with my talents. So part of my talent is in strategy formulation. So working with organizations to reimagine the future and to position ourselves to optimize on what the possibilities are by what we're doing, what we're selling, how we are engaging with the market, and how we're having relevance in a fast-paced, growing world where demand, supply are things that require you to be on the top of your game in terms of knowledge, insights, perspectives, but also responses. So as a strategist, I guess I am a person who assimilates a lot of information from different sectors, companies, and by assimilating that information, I'm able to synthesize insights that are useful for organizations to factor in as they navigate the future journeys and current journeys. And in doing that, I think one of the areas of focus that I predominantly work in is working with people around navigating strategy. So for me, that's where my corporate education contribution comes in, where I work in executive education, corporate education, working with leaders And it really does stem from
Mm.
the strategy conversation as the
Yes,
birthplace,
yes, yes,
understanding what
yes.
your organization exists to do, but really embedded with the human behavior components and elements. How do we exist to
Perfect.
satisfy the desires, wishes, and demands that we are having of these bold visions of tomorrow? So, working with
Mm.
current and future leaders, and I always say I think it's a grounding
Mm.
conversation that I have
Yeah.
around who are we today and who do we want to be and how do we draw upon our history, our heritage, and our way of thinking to navigate this space. So you'll hear me say a lot about how I'm grounded in African storytelling, and that
Oh.
really is about building the narratives we have around our culture, our upbringing, and finding and
Mm.
identifying ways to infuse that into the world of work. So it's not a separate
Powerful.
conversation of I'm an African versus I'm a business person and saying you're all of
Mm.
those. And how do they coexist and how do you actually elevate your Africanness and everything that comes with that
Mm.
identity in solutioning for today, tomorrow,
Oof.
for yourself, for your community, and for the places that you occupy. And so I use
Mm.
storytelling as a platform
Yeah.
to elevate conscious, courageous conversations. I curate safe spaces for powerful, impactful conversations that give opportunity
Mm.
to breathe, that allow us to start really creating a future tomorrow from a place of safety, where there
Mm.
is no fear of showing up or being wrong or
Oh,
somebody being more right.
so
And I think
important.
for me, that's the core of where inclusion comes in, right?
Mm.
I guess I've been talking about inclusion this whole week. And so I think every time you speak about it, it's got a different tone to it or
Yes.
nuance to it. And so inclusion, I guess, this week for me in the work that we do, okay, this t-shirt I'm wearing is Oya Foods, which is our food business, which in and of itself is a proposition that is grounded in inclusion. It's looking at
Mm.
a woman-owned value chain and agribusiness from the farm to the table, ensuring that women are part of that economic value chain of
Mm.
not just primary production, but also beneficiation all the way up to the time that we are consuming it as consumers. So,
Yes.
working on inclusion of women in spaces in the agricultural chain that perhaps they were working on the periphery and bringing that to the fore and forefront and reimagining the business case for what does it look like when we design our own possibilities, right? And so
Oh.
inclusion for me is just that. It's the freedom and the safety to explore your imagination, to
Mm.
explore your contribution to this world in a way that allows your talents to be transacted with. And in
Mm.
that transacting, you are able to be an additive member of community. And it's not always about your financial transacting. It could be about your knowledge base. It could be about your insights, your networks. It could be about your perspective, your lens. But having an
Mm.
opportunity to contribute that to the environments that shape how we interact with products, goods, services, people. Inclusion for me
Mm.
is about having the courage to step away from what is completely certain and embracing the uncertainty to infuse what we haven't heard, what we haven't taken on board as absolute facts, and to
Mm.
work in the obscurity of ambiguity, such that we can create with flexibility. And so we're not nuanced by it's been like this, it is like this, it'll only be like this, but the possibility
Mm.
of an Africa that's awakening and saying, I get it. In fact, one of my favorite sayings lately is, or my favorite awakenings is to the reality that we are, as many Africans, we are code switches all the time. We're constantly
Oof.
code switching. We're constantly
Mm-hmm.
code switching from what we know and inherently and have been raised as to be.
Mm.
So our cultural grounding and context and what that means. But we code switch from the moment we go to school where we are interacting with languages, peoples, cultures that require us to learn, to be observant, to pay attention, and to
Mm.
understand how the rules of the games work, right? And we
Oof.
move that into the world of work. So we code switch. We understand if a cultural dynamic and setting requires me to participate, perform, and interact in a particular way, that it's not what's going to work here. I think we're sitting
Mm,
at the cusp of the greatest opportunity as continent of code switchers who understand the way we know inherently and the way the world wants it to be. And I think that gives you an
mm,
opportunity and lens and say, well, if those are both true and those are both valid, permission
yes.
to create a new thing, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the gift that we come, and that's what inclusion does. Inclusion creates that birthplace for possibility because you're not constrained by the only thing that you know or you see or you've been exposed to. Permission to exist with a brand new template. Yeah.
Hey, Rahima. Can we just okay, I think we're done now.
Bingo, right?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot of mic drops that are there, but I think you've mentioned, I think, a couple of things that are really pertinent for ourselves as individuals, but I think for organizations as well. You mentioned the importance of the freedom to reimagine the possibilities of the future, as well as the importance of safety in creating. So if we want to be bringing in new creation, new products, new ways of doing business, to be able to feel safe in bringing what you also mentioned about being rooted in who we are as Africans, that there's a lot of value in that we can actually bring in a different service, a different look and feel to the market, to the global market that they're actually yearning for.
Mhm.
And inclusion gives us the ability to do that. Very powerful. A lot of gems that are dropped, but I'll leave that to people to pick them up for themselves. Okay, so with that elaborate and I feel very colorful view of inclusion in itself, a number of organizations have got inclusion policies, right?
Mm.
And I think they're well intentioned to have this inclusion that invites everybody. And I think we're getting to a place where we're comfortable with inviting everybody once it, well, let's say predominantly we're comfortable with the concept of inviting everybody. But even well-intentioned organizations default to conditional inclusion. All
Mhm.
right. So let's start off with what is conditional inclusion or what conditional inclusion could look like, and then we can go into why do many intentioned organizations default to conditional inclusion?
Yeah, I think it comes from where the championing is coming from. I think
Mm,
the breadth and spread of what you're willing to do is going to
mm-hmm,
be defined by the willingness of the person championing it to truly be open, right?
yeah.
And there's a beautiful word we all keep using, boundaries and rules. They're there for a reason, and they create,
Mm,
those in themselves are not the problem. They also create safety. They're a form of putting in safeguards for how far we can push it. And also, from
mm,
a risk perspective, it's your tolerance levels for how far you're willing to deviate from what is comfortable before you have to actually rein it in, right?
yeah.
So I don't necessarily bash that. I do understand the role that they play, but I guess that the dual-edged sword that comes in with those things is that change is fluctuating, right? And
Mm,
often, because organizations work with rules and structures, we're very quick to police and put into codified terminology, rules, and regulations around how things exist. Human
mm,
behavior works before that, right? And so, what you'd
mm,
find is that very quickly, those who are working in a different way are going to be brought back into the system, the comfort zone, right?
yes.
And organizations are designed, the rules that we have actually in their systemically reward a particular way and chain. I talk about the information flows in an organization. That's how we
Mm,
communicate. That's how we get things done, is by the architecture of the information in an
yes.
organization. And
Yeah.
so what we've done is that we've policed, if it was hardware, I think you'd put in the infrastructure in a particular way, and that's how it looks. The minute you take
Mm,
something out, you're gonna mess up something else that is
mm,
relying on that, right?
oof,
And
yeah.
so I guess that's the intention, is that you put the hardware that allows it to flow. The challenge is you don't actually know how it's going to flow because you haven't opened up the airwaves completely. You've created just a
Mm,
certain band along which information can flow. It actually does not have room to navigate around that. And as an organization, there's reasons why you'd protect that, because sometimes it's the way that you're doing things also helps to reduce the opportunity for things going wrong, or to, prevent you from lawsuits. It's all sorts of reasons that we rationalize and justify. I
Yes.
guess what we don't accommodate, or we don't have the patience, or even, I guess, the pockets to accommodate, is fallibility of humanity. And that's what we lose. The fact that inclusion or exclusion tends to come in when we are so rigid about what we know and how we do things, that we actually penalize
Mm,
doing something different. And it's not the difference that you're penalizing the ramifications of doing something different and it not working. And that becomes your pullback zone,
mm,
right?
mm,
Whereas
mm,
when you were building, take a startup, when you're building, your propensity to absorb shocks, you will actually sit back and say, school fees. You'll sit back and say graduation, and you
mm,
take those on board. But your willingness to make mistakes until you get to the perfect thing is part of your growth journey. Your
yeah.
complacency, when it works, it's part of your death knell, because your complacency believes that the way you've done it is the only way. Yes, it's the way that's made it work, but
Mm,
that openness now to start trying to do things in a different way is challenging. And I'm going to use the entrepreneurial example again. Not everybody is wired to be entrepreneurial. I think it takes a particular type of personality that can withstand the shocks of uncertainty, ups and downs. Many people just want things to be predictable. They want things to work the way they
mm,
know they're going to work. Many of us in our studying were conditioned to work in organizations that had a predictive way. You will do, if you do XYZ, you will go up the career ladder. The minute you deviate from that,
mm, mm.
persona
What
non
you do?
grata, you've stepped on toes. And I think it's just our human response to things that make us uncomfortable, because I think fundamentally what it requires us to contend with about ourselves. If I've been given a fiefdom, a kingdom, or a place to rule, I want that
Mm,
certainty. If my bonus and my salary are dependent on that,
mm,
girl, I am going to work so hard to make sure that
yeah.
that works the way it works, because I'm guaranteed of the outcomes. The minute I say that
Mm,
the reward is now going to be ambiguous, I've created uncertainty. How many
okay.
people are willing to walk in that uncertainty? So the champion
Mm,
has got to be able to open it up, and the champion has got to get it. The champion has got to evangelize that change. That evangelism. I told a friend the other day, it's you and all your disciples that you need to bring.
yeah.
You and Jesus and all your disciples you need to bring to the table to move this forward, because you need a groundswell of belief. You need a groundswell of faith, even if it's not in the known outcome, that you are trusting either the person leading the process, or you have got a vested interest in an outcome that doesn't look like what you have.
Mm,
Politically, we see that, right? Politically, we'll sit back and say, we're not happy with that one, but we don't know who else, and therefore we are committed to staying with what we have, right?
mm,
That's our
mm.
behavior being drawn into that certainty, our behavior, even though we might not be happy with it.
Yes,
The
yeah.
idea of navigating what we don't know means that we all individually have to be custodians of that, and therefore, who do we step back and allow to take the fall if things don't work?
Yes, 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 yes. Powerful, very powerful. And I love how you mentioned this whole concept of certainty and uncertainty, because now when you are shifting things around how the inclusion looked and felt, to make room for different, to welcome the different, it
Mm,
brings certain levels of uncertainty. And there's something there that you mentioned that I thought was powerful around complacency, that when something works, we can get into a place of complacency. And complacency definitely leads to death. And I think that's very important in this space. Now, another narrative that is out there around inclusion, because inclusion forms part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that inclusion comes at the expense of performance. So how do you balance how do we balance organizational performance with the courage to do inclusion differently?
performance.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we've put in standards as to what performance is naturally. We don't want to drop them. I don't think inclusion, I think short-termism means that we measure success in spurts and bursts, which is
Mm.
unfortunate, right? Because those spurts and bursts tell us a fraction of the journey. The trend line tells the general direction. Often we are measured and rewarded on the short-term bursts, your annual performance review, right? Or
Yeah.
your midterm review, right?
Mm.
And what we are not factoring in again is the room for forgiveness for failure and the lessons from
Mm.
failure, because
Yeah.
what that means is that you are actually you are reinforcing by rewarding what exists, such that you're creating fear to veer away from that. That fear is then
Mm.
a systemic fear, because if reward is short term, any results that I will have that will impact that in the short term end up reflecting on me personally. Now, that's not a truth,
Mm.
right? But that's a behavior system that we've created in the organization that makes it's hard coded to perform in a particular way and to do things in a particular way. So you won't have
Mm.
inclusion because your
Okay.
performance structure is not designed for inclusion. Your
Oh,
performance
okay.
structure is designed to sustain the structure that is here now. So
Mm.
when you change your intention, so strategy defines your structure, systems, and processes. What is it that you want to do? What do you want to
Mm.
achieve? The conversations that we have are crucial. So if we sit back and we say we want to have inclusion, we also have to sit back and say it's a 5 or 10 year journey. We're talking about human behavior. We're talking about adaptation. We're talking about assimilation. We're talking about education, awareness, and we're also talking about adoption, right? So there are a number of things that are happening. We are not machines. It's not flip the switch. There's a certain
Mm.
comfort that I have been able to have by doing things in a particular way. I think this is where, for me, inclusion, when we make it academic,
Mm.
fails to work with how we work as people, but
Yeah.
also fails to appreciate and adopt cultural ways of creating inclusion, right? Simple example.
Mm. Mm.
I love using narrative as a base and as metaphors for what we do socially and culturally, and what that teaches us about how we should be thinking about it. A friend of mine says, unless you understand anthropology, you will not understand how to design systems for humans' participation. Unless you understand the rationale, the reasons for why we do things the way we do them, which then form our cultural context and traditional practices, you won't
Mm.
understand why they're in place and how they inform how we look at situations, how we respond to situations, how those situations impact and affect us, and then affect how the ecosystem works.
Mm.
So I'm going to use one, and I'm making it up as I go, but I
Mm.
think about, inclusion. Um, let's take the birth of a child. Birth of a child in many African child cultures has got a particular process, right? The
Mm.
wife, or the woman, doesn't have to be the wife, the woman who's
Mm.
carrying a baby, typically carries to full term, right?
Mhm.
Let's think about the process for some cultures, and I'm going to use some because I'm appreciating we are not homogenous as Africans. We have
Mm.
got very diverse ways of looking at things. But one particular practice that I'll use for this example is to say the the point where you know that you've fallen pregnant traditionally and culturally was that you don't tell everybody, right?
Mm.
It is, and the word around it, or the socialization, it's a secret.
Yes.
Part of the rationale of that secrecy is that it's a situation that a few people get to know about because they are the immediate circle. In business, when things are happening, it's not everybody that gets
Mm.
to know about it. It's a small trusted circle that are directly involved and impacted by what is happening. As the pregnancy
Mm.
progresses and it becomes obvious and apparent, people who need to be part of that process are included, right? Then you
Mm.
start to make preparations for the child's coming, right?
Mhm.
Let's fast forward to the point where the child is born, and in many cultures, the woman is taken into a space of isolation. That
Mm-hmm.
isolation is really traditionally, culturally, for many, the period where the mother is basically given the opportunity to have those who have walked the journey before her help her to
Mm-hmm.
navigate this brand new experience. No woman
Mm-hmm.
is born with an innate automatic ability to take care of a child. Part of our social imbalances exist because perhaps we haven't done the same thing for fathers as a child comes in, understanding
Oh,
that the nurturing
true.
role was with the woman. But
Very,
there's a
very true.
socialization process where it's been passed down through tradition and culture. Here's a child, this is what you do. And therefore, 3 months later, we say, it's more natural for a woman. No, there was actual cultural practices that we had that indoctrinated the woman, that cultivated a way and process for the woman to take care of a child to be more intuitive. And that was not necessarily through a classroom lecture on a board, but it was through the socialization of aunties, aunts, and a woman was perhaps
Mm,
kept, and the baby kept away from strangers in that period. Not necessarily because it's a secret, but also for health reasons, so that the child is not
mm,
going to be exposed to diseases, etc. In an organization, it's the same thing, right? Just because you've got change, there is a period of cultures of sensitization. Yes, we've got this way of doing things. How can we do it different? What is it that we've been dealing with? I'm all of a sudden a person who has just existed as myself. All of a sudden, there is a whole human being coming out, and what am I supposed to do with this thing?
mm, mm.
How do I take care of it? What does this mean? How do I handle this? And there is a community of support that comes in. Those are your experts. Those are your team leads that come in and say, this is how we have done this before, right? And I
Mm,
think there's an appreciation in cultural practice that even though you've done this before, there is this nuance that you have of having learnt more. And because you've learnt more, you will actually do things slightly differently. I didn't have
mm,
a circle of aunties or aunts. However, I had the internet. So my circle became women that I found on the internet, became help channels, same kind of practice,
mm,
right? And again, some of these become nuanced for a particular gender. But as we are opening up information channels, access to these insights, access to cross engagement, we're creating greater awareness about this phenomenon. Once we've done that,
mm,
then we start interacting with it and asking, what does it mean for you? What does it mean for me? That's
mm.
why I think younger
So
people are having
important.
beautiful, richer conversations about our existence because we're no longer putting it into boxes where it's a woman, it's a man, it's a male, it's a female, it's gendered. No, it's now, this is the experience. How does it exist for you?
Wow.
Organizations miss out on sitting back and saying, what is the equivalent in your cultural background that looks like
Mm,
this? What's an equivalent metaphor or analogy that you are familiar with that would actually link to this? We're so static. Change is this and it's going to be that, but we're not sitting back and saying, where are the narratives where this is actually familiar? Because we've got to
mm,
ground knowledge in safety. We've got to ground acceptance in a sense that, yes, it might not be familiar, but there are nodes of familiarity that I can link into my own personal construct. And so,
mm,
roundabout way of answering you where organizations get it wrong with the intention of inclusion. So, yes, we accept babies, but have you created the have you created the landing, the soft landing for a baby to be present in the space? Have you
mm,
created, and who is involved in that ecosystem of the baby's presence? What does that actually
mm,
mean? For whom and how? How do you bring them into the conversation so we all understand? Beautifully for me is this appreciation that in organizations, everybody's KPA matters. Everybody's
yeah.
KPI matters.
Mm,
Nobody's KPI is more significant than the other because ignored enough, that KPI will sink you. And so,
mm,
if we're all coming in with areas of performance that actually impact this, bring a new baby into this room,
mm,
surely we should all sit back and say, this is how this affects me. This is how I'm seeing it. This is what it reminds me of. This is how I've
mm,
seen it happen. This is how we've dealt with it. This is where it didn't work. And taking time. We're so rushed. We want to bring it in and we want to blame the fact
mm,
that we haven't adopted it. But where in the world do you adopt culture in a very short space of time without allowing for the failure in this ideal that you've created? Also, the opportunity to stop and say, maybe that's not the right way for us to go. It might sound good, but in
Yeah.
practice, here are some of the things that are not going to make it work or don't sit well, and therefore we need to re-navigate. Often we sit back and
Mm,
say, this is the change journey that we're on. We're moving from here to there, and we're going without sitting back. I've rarely had organizations say, yo, we were going there. Let's pause. This is not working. Why is it
yeah.
not working? And sit in the discomfort of the not working and explore. And I think the richness of adoption would come in with that trust that we are allowed to stop the bus when things are not working in this envisioned produced reality, and we are
Mm,
able to sit back and comfort in where we are and move with a bit more certainty once we've all seen how we are moving. Often
mm,
we drop people off that bus because they don't conform to the culture we want. Actually,
mm.
they're not fitting into the system that we are creating that now has these rules and only those rules can apply.
Very, very powerful. There are a number of elements, obviously, that came through there for me, but I think as it relates to this whole idea of sort of like performance and inclusion, is we're measuring the wrong pillars. First and foremostly, we've got pillars that support the current dispensation or the current culture that
Yeah,
we want to open up and make sure that it has room for others. And you might find that the performance measurements that we're using are actually not even the ones that we should be looking at in the first place. And also then how do we then sort of like do inclusion and be courageous enough with doing inclusion differently? There's something that you said that I thought was very powerful, was that we're very academic in
yeah,
how it is that we are doing this inclusion. And hence there's these policies that are academic and then there's lived experience. And you mentioned it around the question of saying, are we even asking the question of saying, how does it feel for you? What is your lived experience of
yeah,
this culture that we think that we are creating?
yeah.
Or
Oh,
have we created it? Yeah.
that's what I'm gonna say to you. Kill me, death by reports.
Death by reports, death by
Death
academic reports.
death by reports, and
Mm.
reports that actually take more time to put together than the work of actually listening to people.
Ooh.
Than the work of actually sitting and being with people and appreciating that not everything can be captured scientifically tabulated, because the science is in the behavioral change that you're going to see. We are so desperate for information and data and insights that tells us stuff that we're
Mm.
missing the stuff that it's telling us in the moment that it's actually speaking.
True,
Yeah.
true.
And I think there's ways and rooms and people we need to validate we're doing this. I think a lot of us don't accept and acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do is experiential and experimental. And if we accept an experimental approach, there are certain things that will always have certainty in your formula. There are certain constants, there are variables that come in. Allow
Mm.
us to play around with the variables and don't be so dogmatic about, and it's got to look like this. I spend a lot of time trying to fit in what is actually happening to the report structure and language that you wanted to fit in, that you actually lose out what is actually
What the
happening
essence
there.
is,
And I say
yes.
to people, can we find different ways of communicating? And can we also start being more open to the fact that what is being communicated in an organization as actually also using different platforms for communication. It might be verbal, non-verbal,
Mm.
audio, visual, and we've got to start adopting that. The fact that it's got to sit in a report so that somebody can come and see, so that what? um,
Mm.
Personal bugbear, but it's also about sitting back and saying, how are we, how are we actually identifying that which is not so obvious that comes as a lag, right? And yes, the argument will
Mm.
be you got to have data points. I had this issue when I was doing my research, and so some of the data points you're asking me to track and monitor are the ones that already exist. And by focusing my attention on that, I'm not even spending any time in identifying brand new ones. And that could be a bit of a problem about creating and structuring our efforts so that they come
Mm,
out into a beautiful language of change because it is acceptable. It's already been codified to look a particular way and not being bold enough and saying it's not been written. And because it's
mm,
not been written, let us allow what is emerging to flow because there are certain fundamentals that any business will continue tracking. It's going to track
mm,
the financials. It's going to track, but it's going to track the financials. It's going to track certain key indicators. It's going to track certain people metrics and certain performance and efficiency metrics, right? There are
mm,
certain people metrics that we haven't, I don't think, perhaps in my own, had a teacher that said that it's not that there's no English word for it. Your knowledge of English is not yet sophisticated enough to know it, right? And I'm going to use that in another way to say it's perhaps not that the metrics don't exist, but my knowledge of the subject matter may be limited,
yes, yeah,
that the metrics I'm not familiar with, rather than discounting their presence.
yeah.
But I think that there is an absence of us finding out and creating with boldness brand new metrics that nobody else is working on or
Mm,
sharing and tracking about what actually matters. And so I would sit back and say, well, you know, if I can sit back and walk into an organization that will boldly say, I've been in existence for 150 years, that's amazing. Those
mm,
metrics that you've defined around your performance, how many of them are influenced by our social, cultural, um, influences that
mm,
are specifically based on where your location is, your geolocation, and your sensitivities and your priorities and your, where are
mm,
we looking at that? Where it's not just comfortable outlooks of it's going to be corporate social investment, but your
mm,
way of doing business, your way of showing up. Yeah. And as an example, I would sit back and say, for instance, we have so many practices traditionally that make sense, and have been there for a reason. Again, I'll use the one of ilobola. I
mm,
might not say it right.
mm, mm,
That's just basically cultural adoption rather than upbringing.
yeah.
And what it is an appreciation that, some of the processes I think always have peak interest for me, and I wonder why we don't adopt them to the world of work. So, for example, when
Mm,
you when the groom's family comes and introduces themselves as process of lamlo, right?
mm,
And this process of being stopped at the gate before you come in, because you have to be acknowledged and recognized, and you have to be invited into a space. What does that mean for how we hold meetings, right? How is that adoption of cultural grace and acceptance and appreciation find its way into how we do business,
mm,
right? So we're gonna
mm,
measure and not how was that successful was that meeting? Yeah, I met the KPI. Did I meet you where you were with humanity? Did I invite you into the space properly? Did you feel that, I acknowledged you and everything about what's my human? I'm going to use words like Ubuntu and it's going to sound great. How have I sensitized them into the way I'm doing business, right? How have I sensitized them into
mm,
my ethos, into it is not something that we will write in an annual report, but it's a way that shows up every
mm,
single day, right? The
mm,
process of Hunzamahadi, right? It's acknowledgement that, this and remuneration and rewards can be that kind of thing. Why don't we adopt certain principles of even how that is actually done, right? In the world of business,
mm,
where are the equivalents? Where are we seeing our cultural heritage find itself into the way we are existing so that it's not a, okay, now I'm going home, I'm going to put on the Magoti cloak. Okay, now I'm going to church and I'm gonna put on my Jesus dress. And then
mm,
now I'm going to, and I'm being very facetious about it because I'm
yes,
not gonna
yes,
take myself too seriously.
yeah.
And what I mean is that every setting and environment has got a cloak that you put on, a suit of armor
Mm,
that
mm,
allows you to walk into it. But some of the world of work means that I must disrobe my Africanness and I must put on a cloak of savvy, Western
mm,
perception. I must look a certain way, must dress a certain way, I must, clock a
mm.
certain way. But it's not challenging me to be a certain way. And I
Oof,
think that is, for me, the disconnect of
powerful.
the essence of the disconnect.
That's very powerful. That disconnect of being, I think it plays into this culture of that's predominant around performance. And I mean, it goes back to the question I asked is it's about performance, but I mean, obviously, then I was talking about the performance of the organization, but then even the performance of the organization at the back of our minds unconsciously is requiring us to perform
Yeah.
rather than to be. And I really think that the more we take time to understand and to unlock some of these concepts that we talk about around a better understanding human behavior, I think we'll be able to unlock the next level of business.
I think
Um,
so.
yeah, and really be able to shift that. All right. So, what specific mindset shifts do leaders need to move from managing diversity to leading with inclusivity?
I'm smiling, right?
Okay.
I guess I'm very troubled by this notion that as Africans, we have to change something. Like, I need to
Mm,
shift my mindset. What's wrong with my mindset? Right? I have to become somebody else. What's wrong with who I am? Where are
mm,
we comfortable with working from where we're at? Why is it a lack? Why is it a base that needs to be transformed, changed in some way? Which means I literally have to discard what I know and how I exist. And I have to always aspire to be standards that somebody else has defined. So, what is an African inspired leadership, I guess, direction? What does that
mm,
look like, right? And we will always
mm,
measure ourselves against, because it's not ABCD, all of those are embedded within how we culturally coexist. And we are very
mm,
social. The fact that we have and our the richness of our social gatherings that define birth, death, burials, weddings, children, childbirth, different stages of
mm.
our lives means that we're
Yeah.
constantly interacting. So interacting with organizations is not a new thing. So
Mm,
why is it how I am in my traditional, cultural, social, native setting? Are you saying that leadership has got to change there and it's also got to change in the world of work? And therefore, there's an overarching change that must happen in the African somehow? Or are we able to
mm.
sit back and say, what is it that you know of how you are and how you exist that the world can learn
Oh,
about
powerful.
how to lead? I would love to answer that because I'm not grappling at my inadequacies.
Mm,
I'm elevating and leading with my propensity and innate design to be a leader. I'm not always grappling at how I need to show up as something. I'm free to be here. And in that is my safety to grow. In that is my permission.
mm,
Because I've given myself permission to exist as I am, I'm more willing to onboard without having to have this guard up that I'm not enough.
mm,
I refuse.
mm,
I
mm.
refuse, and I refuse to have our children grow up with an inadequacy that they need to shift. What did we do that's
Versus,
so wrong to all of us that we are
yeah.
needing to shift? And where are we going?
Mm, mm. Very powerful. And I think it speaks to that whole thing around being and what current leaders need to look into is creating, I suppose, the next question around the psychological safety that my being is welcomed here. And beautiful question that you asked and said, my being is welcome here, and your background and your way of being, what can it teach us around leadership? What can it teach us about creating this product or creating the system or taking us to the next level as an organization? And I think it's important for the leaders that are in the different organization to say, how do we create the psychological safety for people to be?
Yeah.
Obviously, when we bring people on board, we bring people on board who are aligned with the core values of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So they being already should be aligned because that's how they came in. So then we can create the psychological safety for them to be. So how
Exactly.
can leaders create what's in like what are two key elements that are required for psychological safety for people to show up as their authentic selves?
I think that I mustn't feel that my presence or the articulation of my thoughts present a risk to my presence,
Oof.
right? Um, so my presence is not conditional upon me presenting in a particular way, right? My presence
Mm.
should allow the broad reality of my existence. I think a lot of tension, I will speak personally. I think some of my tension personally in environments has been subscribing to I don't look like that. I don't feel like that. I don't see myself in that narrative. But
Mm.
I need to come in there. I need to somehow portray it. How am I portraying what I don't understand or doesn't actually land for me? And nobody's asking me, what does that look like for you? You bring me on board, you sign me up, you give me a contract saying you belong.
Mm-hmm.
And then I spend the rest of my time challenging. And you will rightfully say, but you already said you belong. But all the structures say you belong, but you must look like this. You must sound like this. And at no point in time am I having an opportunity to say, please, can you hear what I actually sound like? When I'm not sounding like what everybody's designed to sound like, here's what I actually sound like. And that freedom for those thoughts, ideologies, perspectives to exist without challenge, right? They
Mm.
exist. I think like that. Oh, she thinks like that. How beautiful is that? And so you can't think like that. You can't. We keep saying what we cannot do. And I keep working in a space of the rules say, okay, but who created the rules
Who
and how
created?
come I'm brought in to only pay attention to the rules, but there's no listening to what do the rules actually mean for how did I hear the rules? In my world, how do these rules resonate, right?
Oof.
How do we treat these rules in my world? And to appreciate that the rules have
Mm.
different ways of existing and achieving the same goal. So we come in
Mm.
and we have conflicted sometimes with, yes, I see the rules, but I'm a full functioning human being. And therefore, surely I'm created in his image, and therefore my thought processes are valid, right? But
Mm.
somehow they're not
Mm.
valid. We create so many contradictions about coexisting and being where one way of being has got more right to be than the other.
Mm. Mm.
It
Mm.
sounds like what was that novel? Not A Brave New World, the other one, the boys on an island. But anyway, I can't remember what it was. Was in this, don't worry, it's very dark thoughts. It went right back to 1984.
Okay. Come
Very
back.
random. My mind does that, just goes so random. I just know that Captain, my Captain, there's some Lord of the Flies.
Oh, Lord of the
Yeah,
Flies.
you
Lord of
must
the
come to
Flies.
back. Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, no, no. That's very powerful. And I think in our closing question,
Yeah.
um, one of the key things I think that's coming out of here is the importance of feedback, honest dialogue, and creating the room for the different people within organizations to actually take a step back and to be able to listen and then see what they then have the ability to do with these different insights in terms of creating this inclusive inclusion within their workspaces. So what are maybe two or three different opportunities for organizations to be able to say, these are the places that we can have honest dialogue or honest feedback that we actually want to listen to? Because the other question that I had was around how do we close the gap between policy and lived experience. And then I
Yeah.
realized, no, actually, the reason why there's a gap between them is potentially the inability or the lack of platforms to actually listen to what the lived experience is.
Yeah.
And so, what are some of those platforms that they can create to be able to start having these necessary dialogues to see what is really sitting in the system
Yeah.
and then be able to work with that?
Brave leadership. The
Very
invitation to
true.
speak means
Yeah.
that the invitation to create platforms for speaking means that there's definitely going to be things you don't want to hear, right? So brave leadership
Mm.
means a ready leadership that is not that is sufficiently grounded in or sufficiently relinquished of their ego to allow transformation to happen, which means there's not necessarily controlling. It can only exist like this, or that's too dangerous. We tend to curb things before letting them get, oh, that's gone too far, and now we can't, right? And we'd always
Mm,
pull ourselves back from, well, it's thoughts. It's thoughts, and we
mm,
say those are dangerous. I think what's dangerous is when we make thoughts and ideas go underground and they fester. I think what's dangerous is not contending and letting thoughts breathe in a way that allows us to have rich dialogue. It's the opportunity, one, to air ideas, opinions, whether it is open cast or it is a annual publication of stories by staff members. I do think we need to find
mm,
ways of expression, whether, and by the way, storytelling is not just necessarily your oral, it's also your performing arts.
mm,
Let's find ways of expression, self-expression, that
mm,
people in an organization can bring their true self, and
mm,
bring their preferred self, right? Because there's a
mm,
self that you bring that pays the bills, and not everybody's sitting in a job that is, this is my, I wake, I'm, this for me is a do or die. But not
mm.
everybody is sitting in a space, a privileged space of, this is what I want to do, but allow that person's fullness to be present and hear how they're thinking, what they're thinking. Have intentionality about listening, right? So,
Mm,
in that intentionality means that information is powerful when it's transacted upon, and therefore the transaction means that you're able to take it and you're able to either utilize it immediately, transform it, but there's a utilization. There's something
mm,
about feeling like I'm just speaking into the air, nothing ever happens. So, if you're going to give
very
space for people
important.
to speak, demonstrate
Mm,
that they are heard,
mm,
demonstrate that there is a listening. So in the same way you are creating space for audio or visual or speaking, create architects of listening, because those architects
mm,
of listening are the ones who are actually now going to start designing against the listening.
mm.
And don't be so static in that we did an employee survey and it showed this. Oh, okay. You can see I'm tired about certain things. You see, I think you get to a certain age, you're like, I'm tired. I'm not new to this. What my sister say, I'm not new to this. I'm true to this.
I like
We
that.
we're gonna be we've got to actually sit back and say how else. And I think there is something to be said about younger ways of engaging with information. I am excited. I'm excited of intergenerational sharing because both are
Yes.
value. None has got more
Yeah.
significance than the other. One is going to have a more dominant play in the future, but it doesn't mean
Mm,
we need to diminish. And we need to be looking at signals strategically. Watch the signals and
mm,
sit back and say, and that's the power of not just the platform for speaking, the platform for listening. That's where your strategists are sitting
mm,
back because they're taking
mm.
all those and they're
True.
connecting the dots and they're saying, what does this mean? But it's not just in terms of, sales and you're sitting back and saying, what does it mean for what our people want to have as a place to be? How do we co-create, coexistent? Because we are social, we're communal, we are interrelated, and the work that we do is integrated. What are the new constructs of being collectively? And that's what we need to be
Mm,
designing for,
mm,
based on what we're
mm,
listening to and what all the other signals are saying. And because we are listening, what we must shy away from is saying, and here's the formula, and saying, here's the space we're going to create for it to be emerging. And here's how we're going to capture our lessons from what's emerging.
mm. Yeah, no, Rahim, we could be having this conversation until tomorrow. That
I
is
do
that
gotta
is
go.
that is yeah, no, we need to go. But really, really powerful points that you brought out there, around the importance of just creating different rooms, for people to speak, and it's not just, what it is that is actually just said, and the ability to perform is also another way of actually getting feedback. And I just had a thought in my mind, and something that you said, but came to me is there's room for people to be able to showcase, what some of these rules actually mean in their culture, or how they show up in their culture, or what leadership actually looks like in their culture, and for them to say from these from this background and from this knowledge that I have, this is how I think it can improve the business. So that it's
Absolutely.
not just about, yes, what it is they can extract from the culture, but what can they extract to elevate the business, to
Yes.
elevate the position, to elevate what it is that they're doing. So there's so much power in dialogue and so much power that's actually just sitting in the individuals that are sitting in different corporates. If we can just have, as you call it, brave leadership.
Brave leadership.
And yeah, brave leadership. Rehema, I want to say thank you so, so much. We have definitely run out of time, but this conversation has been absolutely amazing, and I think people will really enjoy it and have a lot of light bulbs actually just going off on their behalf. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity of just airing thoughts. I think I always say to people, the thoughts that I have today may change tomorrow, influenced by what is coming through,
Mm,
and not to be held static. And in that moment, that might be the dominant thought that's coming through. I give myself permission that it might change based on what I will see, hear, be guided upon. And
mm.
so that's how we are sharing in this context. And thank you for that opportunity.
That's why you were the perfect person for this conversation. I didn't even know why you actually even said that. I knew it. You're the perfect person for this conversation because your ability to reimagine the future is aspirational, inspirational. So continue doing the great work that you're doing. Okay.
Thank you.